The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Ruth Callander buried her husband, and the same day the bank sent a man out to the farm to count the cattle. She was still in her good dress when the bank's man pulled up in his truck. 43 head of Hereford, a 1949 International Harvester that needed a new clutch, and a barn with a roof that had been losing shingles since the spring. He wrote it all down in a small notebook without saying much, and Ruth stood in the yard watching him and didn't say much either. The dress had a button missing at the collar. She'd noticed it that morning and hadn't had time to fix it, and she kept touching the gap with 2 fingers the way you touch a loose tooth. The letter was from her father-in-law, Gordon Callander, and it was short. He was exercising his right, under the original deed agreement, to reclaim the property. He was sorry for her loss. He hoped she understood. She understood. She'd read the deed herself 6 years ago when she and Martin had signed it. She'd been 23, and Martin had been 30, and they'd both thought Gordon Callander was the kind of man who would never actually use a clause like that. She had been wrong about that and about a few other things. The farm went to Gordon. The cattle went to the bank. Ruth got the truck, her tools, a winter's worth of canned goods she'd put up herself, and a piece of land that had been her grandmother's, and that everyone in the Peace River country had a polite way of describing as not worth the taxes. Her neighbor, Frank Tessier, said it when she told him she was going north. He was a careful man, not unkind, and he leaned against his fence post and looked at the gravel road for a moment before he spoke. "That quarter section up near the notch," he said. "Agnes Keel's place. It was her place. It's mine now." "Doesn't drain," Frank said. "Spring melt, the whole lower field goes under. Agnes couldn't do a thing with it. Nobody could." He paused. What was she thinking, leaving it to you? "I don't know. She left it to me anyway." He looked at her with the expression of a man who had more to say and had decided not to say it. "You've got friends here, Ruth. There's work at the Fetters in operation if you need it. You don't have to go up to that place." "I know I don't." She thanked him and finished loading the truck and drove north. The land was everything Frank had described and less. 160 acres of boreal muskeg, black spruce, and standing water, cut through by a creek that had no name on any map she'd found. The quarter section sat at the base of a long limestone escarpment the locals called the Notch, where the rock face came down at an angle and pressed the land into a shallow basin that held water the way a cupped hand holds rain. Agnes Keel had built a cabin on the highest ground, a spruce log structure that was still standing, mostly. One wall had settled badly where the permafrost shifted, giving the whole building a slight lean that you noticed more the longer you looked at it. The stovepipe had come apart at the second joint, and there was a bird's nest in the gap. The door hung on one hinge. Ruth sat in the truck for a long time looking at it. She got out and walked the property for the rest of the afternoon, moving through the spruce and tamarack, marking the water lines on the trees with a piece of orange flagging tape. The flood history was written plainly if you knew how to read it. Dead sedge and debris piled against the lower trunks. A tide of old silt at the base of the escarpment fanned out across the lower field in the shape of a wing. The upper ground, the bench closest to the rock face, had stayed dry. She could see it in the root structure of the trees there, the way they grew straight and deep instead of the shallow sprawl of roots that characterized the trees in the wet zones. She had $40 left after fuel, and winter was coming the way it always came in northern Alberta, without apology and ahead of schedule. The first 2 weeks she spent on the cabin. She reset the sunken wall post by post, using a come-along she'd rigged to a spruce tree and a hydraulic jack she'd brought from the farm. The work was slow and the ground was uncooperative. Every time she got one corner lifted, another would settle in a direction she hadn't expected. She lost 4 days to a problem with the sill log that had rotted through on the north face. She pulled it out, cut a new one from a standing dead spruce at the edge of the property, and set it in on a bed of gravel she'd hauled up from the creek in a wheelbarrow. The door she rehung herself, cutting new pintles from a piece of strap iron she'd found in Agnes's shed. The stovepipe she joined with a sheet metal patch and a ring of stove cement. When she lit the first fire and the smoke rose straight up, instead of backing into the room, she sat on the floor with her back against the wall and let out a breath she felt she'd been holding since the funeral. It wasn't a fixed cabin. It was a functional one. There was a difference, and she knew it, but functional was what she needed right now. The cold set in hard in October. Ruth worked through it, splitting firewood until her stack was shoulder high and 10 feet long, cutting it from the standing dead she found along the escarpment. She set snare lines along the creek and caught rabbits, which she skinned and stretched and hung to smoke over a slow alder fire she kept going in a cut-down barrel near the shed. She found a cache of Agnes's preserves in the root cellar, 12 jars of something that had once been Saskatoon berry jam and was now an uncertain color, and 4 jars of pickled beets that were probably fine. She ate the beets. She left the jam. The problem she couldn't solve was the land itself. She'd known going in that the lower field was useless for any conventional cropping. Too wet, too cold, frost in the ground until late May, and back again by early September. But she needed the land to produce something if she was going to stay, and staying was the only plan she had. She was not going back to offer herself as day labor at the Feddersen operation. She was not going to be the woman whose husband died and who had nothing left after. She started spending time at the escarpment. The limestone wall at the back of the property ran about 300 yards across the upper edge of the quarter section, rising maybe 40 feet at its highest point. At the base of it, where the rock met the bench ground, the soil was different, darker, drier. In a few places it was almost crumbly, which was not a word she would have applied to anything else on this property. She got down on her hands and knees one afternoon and dug with her fingers and smelled the soil the way her grandmother had taught her, and it smelled alive in a way the lower field didn't. Mineral and faintly sweet, the smell of deep decomposition that had been working a long time without interruption. She started digging test holes, 6 of them, spaced along the base of the rock, each one a foot wide and 2 feet deep. She recorded what came out of each one in a spiral notebook. At the third hole, her shovel hit something that rang differently, not rock. She got down and cleared the dirt away with her hands. The opening was roughly oval, about 3 feet wide and 20 inches tall. The kind of entrance a person would have to crawl through. The air that came out of it was notably warmer than the air at the surface, which was 7 degrees Celsius and dropping. She pressed her hand against the opening and held it there for a full minute. Steady, even warmth. Not dramatic, not hot, just constant. She went back to the cabin and got her headlamp. The cavity behind the opening was bigger than the entrance suggested, as these things often are. She had to belly crawl the first 8 feet, and then the floor dropped away slightly, and she could get to her knees, and then to a crouch, and then, when the chamber opened up fully, she could stand. She stood in the dark and swung her headlamp in a slow circle. The main chamber was perhaps 12 meters across and not quite that in depth. The ceiling was irregular limestone, higher in the center, dropping at the edges. The floor was dry earth and gravel, uneven but walkable. Along the back wall, groundwater seeped in a thin film down the rock face and pooled in a depression at the base, about the size and depth of a chest freezer. The water was clear. She put her hand in and then her palm to her mouth. Cold, clean, no taste worth noting. The temperature in the chamber, she estimated, was between 8 and 12 degrees Celsius. She couldn't be certain without a thermometer, but she would get one. She lay on her back on the cave floor for a long time, her headlamp off, listening to the water and the silence and the sound of her own breathing. She was thinking about her grandmother Agnes, who had owned this land for 30 years and apparently never found this, or had found it and said nothing, keeping it for a reason Ruth couldn't know. Either way, it didn't matter now. What mattered was what it was. It was a root cellar that never froze. It was a water source that didn't require a pump. And it was a growing chamber, if she could bring in enough light and enough soil. Her grandmother had grown tomatoes in a cold frame that pushed the season by 6 weeks. What Ruth had here pushed it by the entire calendar, if she could get it right. She went back to the surface and sat on a rock at the base of the escarpment and worked through what she had versus what she needed. The math was uncomfortable, but not impossible. The soil at the base of the escarpment was the best on the property. If she built raised beds inside the chamber using that soil, mixed with compost she could make from the kitchen waste and forest stuff, she could start growing root crops and greens. Potatoes would probably do well. Carrots, beets. The greens would need more light, and candlelight wasn't going to cut it, no matter what a person wished. But Agnes had left a small gasoline generator in the shed, if it ran, and if Ruth could rig grow lights, or even a set of mirrors to direct natural light down through the entrance during the day, she might be able to manage a leafy green bed along the mouth of the chamber where the light would be best. She knew enough not to fool herself. Light was the real constraint. The list of crops that could produce in genuinely low light conditions was short. Potatoes, because the edible part grew underground and needed only enough leaf surface to run photosynthesis for the tuber. Some varieties of kale, which could survive at light levels that would kill other greens. Mushrooms, which needed no light at all. And sprouts, which needed only days to go from seed to edible. That was the crop list. Not a farm, not a garden. A survival system that could carry her through winter and give her something to work with in spring. She went back to the cabin and made a list of materials, and then made a second, shorter list of materials she could actually get. The generator ran. That was the first piece of good news. It was a 4-stroke Briggs & Stratton that hadn't been started in at least 2 seasons, and it took her most of a morning to get it going. But once it fired, it ran smoothly enough. She found 2 fluorescent shop lights in the shed rafters, still in their cardboard packaging, which Agnes had apparently bought and never installed. Ruth didn't want to know what gasoline would cost per month if she ran them on the generator, but she also didn't have another option, so she filed the worry and moved on. The mirror system she solved with 2 sheets of salvaged corrugated tin, a length of bale wire, and a jar of white latex paint she found in the shed. She painted the tin white, bent it to the right angle, and mounted it above the cave entrance to catch the low autumn sun and direct it inward. It worked better than she'd expected, and worse than she'd hoped, which was about what she'd budgeted for. She spent 2 weeks building the raised beds. There were 4 of them, framed with spruce poles and floored with a layer of coarse gravel from the creek, then filled with the dark bench soil mixed with forest duff she'd composted through the summer without knowing she'd need it. She hauled the soil in 5-gallon buckets, a job she did not want to calculate the time on, and pressed the seed potatoes into the beds in late October, when any rational person in northern Alberta was thinking about getting their yard equipment under cover. The mushroom beds were simpler. She'd found a stand of dead birch along the creek with good mycelium already established in the wood. She cut sections of it, inoculated them with spawn she'd ordered by mail-in. A moment of what she'd told herself was optimism, and everyone else would have called recklessness, and stacked them in the darkest corner of the chamber where the humidity from the seep pool kept the air damp without being wet. The kale she started in the shop light section, near the chamber entrance, in a shallow bed that got 6 hours of combined natural and artificial light on a clear day. She'd grown kale before, knew it was tough, and trusted it to take. It did. By mid-November, when the surface temperature had dropped to -20, and the muskeg was locked under a foot of ice, there were green things growing in the dark at the base of the escarpment, and Ruth felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was that she had made the right decision. She did not share this feeling with anyone, because there was no one to share it with. Her nearest neighbor was a man named Denny Wick, who ran a small trapline out of a half-finished bungalow about 4 kilometers south on the same road. She'd met him once, in early October, when his dog had shown up at her cabin door with a piece of broken snare line tangled in its collar, and she'd driven it back. He was a quiet man, around 60, who moved with the deliberate economy of someone who'd been working alone for a long time. He'd thanked her for the dog and looked at her truck with the particular attention a person gives to a vehicle that might not make it through the winter. "You're staying up here?" he said. "I am." He didn't argue with it. She appreciated that. "Road gets bad in January," he said. "Past bad. February you can't get out unless the county comes through, and some years they don't hurry. I know. You've got supplies? I'm working on it." He looked at the truck again. "If you need something you can't get, come knock. I've got a radio that reaches the co-op in High Prairie. Sometimes." He went back inside without further ceremony, and that was the extent of their neighborliness through October and November. What Ruth did not account for, what she could not have accounted for without knowing it was coming, was the water. The Peace River country got its share of winter, but the winter of that year was different. The snowpack in the foothills had been building since September, and in the second week of December, 3 days of freezing rain came and put a crust on top of it that sealed the moisture in like a lid. When the temperature climbed briefly in late December, the melt had nowhere to go. The creek at the base of her property, normally a foot wide in winter, became something else. She heard it at night, a sound she didn't recognize at first, a low, sustained rushing that was present when she woke at 2 in the morning and still present when her alarm went off at 6. She put on her headlamp and went to see. The creek had gone out of its banks sometime in the night. The lower field was under a foot of gray-green water that moved slowly in the flat, purposeless way of floodwater that has nowhere specific to go. It was advancing toward the bench ground, not fast, but persistently. She stood at the edge of the water in the dark and watched a plastic bucket she used for hauling soil go past in the current, spinning slowly. She went back inside and thought about what it meant. The cabin was above the flood line. She'd checked that when she arrived, and she'd been right. The bench ground sat high enough that the water would have to rise another 4 feet to reach the foundation, and that wasn't going to happen unless the drainage backed up completely, which it hadn't done, as far as she could tell. The cave entrance was above the current water line, but the lower approach to it would be underwater before morning. The crops inside the chamber were fine. The chamber itself was sealed from the water by its own geology. She was not going to lose the beds. What she might lose was access to them, depending on how high it came. She went back out with the good flashlight and marked the water level at the base of 3 spruce trees with a square of orange flagging tape. Then she went inside and put the kettle on and sat at the table and waited. By 9 in the morning, the water had risen 8 inches. By noon, it had stopped. By 3 in the afternoon, it had dropped 2 inches, then 3. The winter melt was draining somewhere downstream, the way it eventually does when enough pressure builds, and the flood receded through the night the way it had come, leaving a slick gray crust of silt across the lower field and a rim of ice along the edges of the bench ground. Ruth walked the property in the morning with the same careful attention she'd given it when she arrived. She checked the cabin foundation. She checked the flagging tape marks on the trees. She checked the cave entrance, which was accessible again, the ground in front of it muddy but solid. Then she did something she'd been putting off because she hadn't wanted to know the answer. She went down to the lower field and crouched in the silt and put her hand flat on the ground. The flood had been bad. But the silt the flood left behind was something worth looking at. A half-inch of fine alluvial deposit, dark and dense, spread across 30 acres of ground that had otherwise been growing nothing but sedge and horsetail. She rubbed it between her fingers. She smelled it. It was the same smell as the bench soil, deep and mineral and alive, but even richer because it had come down off the limestone uplands with everything the creek carried. She stood up slowly. The lower field had drained completely by now, the surface dry except in the hollows. And what the flood had left was, she was beginning to think, not a disaster but a resource. The question was how to stop it from being a disaster the next time. She spent 3 days walking the creek corridor and the base of the escarpment, and on the 4th day she drove into the nearest town, which was an hour south, and spent an afternoon in the library with a set of agricultural drainage maps and a notebook. What she was looking for was the principle behind a raised bog system, which she'd read about once in a magazine article about cranberry operations in British Columbia. The principle was straightforward. Instead of fighting the wet ground, you work with it by managing where the water goes and keeping your production on high ground or elevated beds. She didn't have the infrastructure or the capital for a commercial bog operation. What she had was a limestone wall, a warm cave, and 30 acres of newly silted ground that would grow something, if she directed the drainage and chose the right crops. Wild rice would grow in standing water. She knew this because her grandmother had grown it in a flooded ditch once, as an experiment, and had shown Ruth the results when she was 11 years old. You couldn't harvest it without a canoe, ideally, but you could grow it, and if you could sell it or trade it, wild rice was worth money. Cranberries needed similar conditions. Flooded fields and acid soil. She didn't know yet whether this soil was acid enough, but she could test it. Cattails grew in standing water and were edible at multiple stages. She already had them. She'd been harvesting the rhizomes all fall without thinking of them as a crop. She started writing it down, not as a plan so much as an inventory of possibilities, because a plan required capital she didn't have, and she'd learned this winter not to plan past what she could actually execute. She was still sitting with the notebook at the library table when the woman at the front desk came over and stood at a respectful distance. "We close at 6, she said. "But if you need anything copied or printed, you've got about 10 minutes. Ruth looked up. She hadn't noticed the light changing outside the window. "Thank you," she said. "I'm done." The woman looked at the notebook and then at Ruth, the way people look at someone they've been watching from across a room. "You're the one staying up at the Agnes Keel place," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am. Agnes was my mother's cousin," the woman said. "I'm Vera Ouellette." She sat down across from Ruth without asking, in the comfortable way of a woman accustomed to libraries. "We didn't know she left the land to you, or who you were." A pause. "You married a Callander?" "I did. Martin died in September." "I'm sorry." Ruth nodded. The condolences were getting easier to receive, not because they hurt less, but because she'd learned to let them pass through her like weather. "How's the place?" Vera asked. "It's standing." Vera studied her. She was a compact woman in her late 50s, with the kind of unhurried attention in her face that took years to develop. Agnes always said there was something on that property nobody'd figured out yet. Said the land had more in it than people thought. She tilted her head slightly. "I always thought she meant oil. There's a cave," Ruth said. "At the base of the escarpment, I've been growing things in it." Vera was quiet for a moment. "Growing what?" "Potatoes, kale, mushrooms, some sprouts. In December. In December." Vera looked at the notebook again, and then at Ruth with a new quality of attention. "Does it work?" "Yes." There was a silence. The library's heater ticked. Outside, a truck went past on the main road, its headlights sweeping across the window. "My brother-in-law farms 3/4 south of town," Vera said finally. "He's been losing his early crop to late frost since he took over the operation. 4 out of the last 5 years." She paused. "You should talk to him. I'm not in a position to take on anyone else's problems right now." "No, I didn't mean that." Vera folded her hands on the table. "I meant you should let him know what you're doing. That's a different thing." Ruth looked at her notebook and then at the window. She thought about Frank Tessier telling her about work at the Feddersen operation, the comfortable, practical arithmetic of other people's advice. She thought about Vera's cousin's land, and the cave she'd found in it, and the green things growing in it right now in the dark, with a storm outside. "All right," she said. The brother-in-law was named Paul Seguin, and he came out to the property on a Sunday in January in a 1-ton pickup with good tires. A man in his late 40s who moved carefully on ice and wore the expression of someone who had agreed to look at something he did not expect to be impressed by. Ruth showed him the cave. She lit the shop lights and let him see the beds. He stood in the main chamber for a long time without speaking. He looked at the kale. He crouched down and pressed his thumb into the soil of the potato bed. He examined the mushroom blocks in the dark corner and then straightened up and looked at the seep pool and the sheet metal mirrors angled above the entrance and the full setup she'd built over the course of 3 months with material she'd mostly found on the property or salvaged from Agnes's shed. "These are actually growing," he said. "They are. In January. Yes." He looked at the entrance, the pale winter light coming in at a low angle across the mirror surface and spreading into the chamber. "The temperature stays stable, 8 to 12 Celsius. I've been logging it since November. Never dropped below 7, even during the cold snap." He was quiet for another moment. "The soil base is local?" "The bench above the escarpment. I've been mixing it with composted duff." He nodded, slowly, the way a person nods when they are not agreeing so much as working something out in their mind. "What are you planning to do with the lower field? After the melt?" "That's what I've been working on." She told him about the silt deposits and the bog crop research and the cattails, and he listened the way she'd seen people listen to things that rearranged their expectations, not interrupting, not reaching for the objection that was easiest. When she finished, he said, "Wild rice needs a water management system to harvest at scale. You'd need some equipment." "I know. I've got a low-bed trailer, and I know the man at the Drainage Authority who signs off on creek diversions." He paused. "I'm not offering charity. I'm saying there's a conversation to be had when you're ready to have it." Ruth looked at him. She was not particularly inclined to trust people who showed up at her property with offers, and she had reason not to be. But there was a difference between a man who wanted something from you and a man who saw something you were already doing and wanted to be part of it. She couldn't always tell the difference in the moment, but she'd gotten better at watching for the signs. "Come back in March," she said. "We'll see where the water sits after melt, and I'll have a better read on what the lower field can actually do." He nodded. He didn't push. She noted that. He was almost at the mouth of the cave when he stopped and turned back. "The mushrooms," he said. "What kind?" "Oyster, mostly." I've got some lion's mane trying in the far corner, but I'm not sure it'll take. Oyster mushrooms sell for $12 a pound at the High Prairie Co-op, he said. If you can produce volume. I know, she said. He looked at her for a moment, with something that might have been respect and might just have been reassessment. Then he ducked under the low section of the cave entrance and went back out into the January light. Ruth stood in the chamber alone and looked at the beds and the lights and the reflection of pale winter sun on the white tin mirrors. The mushroom blocks in the corner had 3 new pins on them, small gray nubs pushing out of the inoculated wood. She hadn't noticed them this morning. She crouched down and looked at them up close. 3 pins, each one smaller than the tip of her finger, each one the beginning of something. She had come to this land with $40 and a deed nobody else wanted. She had walked into a winter that had been trying to solve her the way a river solves a log, by rolling her until she snagged somewhere or went under. She hadn't snagged, and she hadn't gone under. She had found the warm place in the rock and put her hands in the soil and made things grow in the dark, and now it was January and she was still here. She thought about Martin, which she tried not to do too often, because grief was not something she could afford to spend a lot of time in, not in winter, not alone. She thought about what he would have said standing in this chamber. He had been a practical man who respected practical things, and he would have looked at the beds and the mirrors and the seat pool with the quiet attention he gave to things that worked. He wouldn't have made a speech about it. He would have said something like, "Not bad, Ruth," in the way he said things that he meant considerably more than the words indicated. "Not bad, Ruth." She stood up and went to check the kale. The winter broke slowly, the way northern Alberta winters do, not with any drama but with a gradual loosening, temperatures rising in increments too small to celebrate and then dropping back. 3 steps forward and 2 back across March and into April. Until one morning she walked outside, and the air smelled like wet spruce and open ground, and the creek was running clearly in its banks. She had not gone under. The mushrooms had produced their first flush in February, just over 2 pounds of oyster mushrooms that she harvested and kept cool in the shed and drove to the High Prairie Co-op in a foam cooler on a day when the road was bad enough that she was not certain she would make it. She made it. The co-op bought the mushrooms at $11.50 a pound. She sat in the parking lot with the money in her hand for a moment and then drove home. Paul Seguin came back in April, as she'd suggested, and they walked the lower field together in rubber boots, assessing the melt pattern, the drainage channels, the silt deposits. He had done research over the winter and had printed pages of it. She had done the same, and they compared notes in the way of 2 people who had both been working on the same problem from different angles, and were mildly surprised to find the other had gotten as far as they had. The conversation about the creek diversion took 3 hours. The one about the water management equipment took another 2. By the end of it, they had a working arrangement on paper, not a partnership and not charity, but a cost-share agreement for equipment use with a proportional return on the wild rice and cranberry plantings, if either of them took hold. Vera Ouellette's brother-in-law shook her hand when he left. He had a direct way of doing it, looking at her and meaning it. "Agnes would have liked you," he said. "You didn't know Agnes," Ruth said. "I knew of her. Everybody in that area did." He paused at the door of his truck. She was the kind of woman who held on to things. Ruth thought about her grandmother sitting on this land for 30 years without finding the cave, or finding it and saying nothing. Either way, she'd held on to the land and left it to the one person she'd thought might be able to do something with it. Maybe she'd been right, and maybe she'd been guessing. It didn't matter which. The land was here, and so was Ruth, and the cave was warm and green things were growing in it. And the lower field was coming up in fresh sedge, and the first cattail shoots were pushing through the mud at the creek margin, thin and green and intent. She worked through the spring the way she'd worked through the winter, not because it was easy, not because she was certain of anything, but because this was her ground now, all 160 acres of it, the flooded field and the limestone wall and the dark, warm chamber in the rock, and taking care of it was the same as taking care of herself. The mushroom blocks produced their second flush in May, 4.5 pounds. She didn't sit in the parking lot this time.